1:45. Okay, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to talk today about alternative land access. This is a topic I've been researching for a few years, done some presentations on, but this is a slightly different take on it. I am passing out survey evaluations. This is a grant-funded project, so it's actually kind of a mixed project. The American Farmland Trust put together a project called Farmland for the Next Generation, which developed a curriculum to support training new and beginning farmers how to access land and how to make that transition. So the Kansas Rural Center put in a SARE grant to support that curriculum by adding emphasis on alternative methods of land transfer. So we're kind of jumping off from some of the traditional methods of land transfer, just basic buying, selling, and leasing, and we're going to talk about some variations on that. All of the land access in America really is based on those fundamental principles of some sort of purchase, selling, or leasing. So what we're going to talk about today is kind of maybe some innovative twists on that concept. Let's see, for everybody coming in here, I'm going to run around and give you guys evaluations. If you can fill those out and give them back to me at the end, I would really appreciate it. As grant-funded projects, the funders always like to know information. Was this grant useful? Did people, seeing the presentation, learn something about it? So if you can fill those out, give them to me or leave them on your seat at the end there, I would really appreciate the feedback. And it will help us improve the presentation for future purposes also. So it's not just to fill out the report, but ideally we're getting better at this every time we do it. So our goal here is really to provide an overview. So this is a high-level view of some innovative ways that people have used to access land. So to go through that, we're going to start by talking about what is land tenure. I actually rearranged this the other day, so values, vision, and goals is actually going to be kind of where I close out. But then I'm going to talk about 3 different models and tools for land access. And so to start about that, land access is really how people get access to land. And that starts with this concept of land tenure. Now in the United States, we really have 2 main ways that people can get access to land. They can either own it outright or they can lease it. In other countries and other cultures, sometimes there are different options for communal land holdings. And some of those have kind of inspired what I'm going to talk about. But all of these ideas really come back to some form of getting land access through owning or leasing it, but these are kind of creative ways to help people that maybe are having challenges. But land tenure is, how people access land, but it's important to understand this as really a bundle of rights. So when you're accessing land, you have some rights and responsibilities that are defined by laws, and then for landowners, and then for tenants, what your rights and responsibilities are is defined by those lease agreements. But one way to think about these bundle of rights is to think about all the different things that can come with land. So often that'll include things like subsurface mineral rights. It might include water rights if you have water rights that go with that piece of land. There are other things we're going to talk quite a bit about with easements, which is rights for certain things. So sometimes a common one is like a utility easement where the utility company can come on your property, put a new power line or put a pipeline or whatever that easement is for. So even though you might own a piece of land or someone might own a piece of land, certain subsets of those rights have been sold or distributed in some other way. And that's going to be really important when we get into some of the ways to make land more accessible is by, sort of allocating some of those rights in different ways. So yeah, there's all these bundles of rights. So water rights, timber rights, energy, mineral rights, and those are all conveyed in the deed. explaining who has what right to what access. And so some of these can limit what happens on there. So conservation easements or other deed restrictions are things that can limit what you can do on land. So a conservation easement would be putting land maybe into permanent conservation practices, or deed restrictions. You can think about those in urban areas, like a homeowners association is a way to restrict what you can do on your land. Those restrictions get conveyed with the deeds. Sometimes people will have public access. If you have a piece of land that maybe limits some access to something else, there might be a right for power company to cross your land and do something, or the city utility company to cross your land and do something, or even public access. And so what rights are available is totally bound up by federal and state laws, as well as local laws, and zoning is a good example of a way to think about some of these rights. So you own land, but you can't just do anything you want with that if you're in a zoned county. You can do what the county allows you to do. You can have this size of house, but not that size of house. You can only, build one house if you have a plot that's 5 acres or larger. So all of those things are ways to think about, if you own land or if you lease land, you don't have a universal set of rights. You have a really specifically, narrowly, legally defined set of rights. And that varies from parcel to parcel, location to location. Different states have different laws, all of that. So that concept is going to be really kind of one of the jumping off points that allows some of these more innovative ways for people to access access land, maybe by allowing some of those rights, putting an easement on there that makes sure that the land is always in agriculture. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. I do want to make a disclaimer here. Like, I am not a lawyer. Hopefully we'll have some time here at the end for questions and conversations. But if you want like specific legal advice on how to do any of these things, like, I'm not the right person to give that to you. So what we're going to talk about is a few conceptual topics to hopefully, if you are having problems accessing land, or if you have land you're trying to figure out how to make it more accessible for others, hopefully they'll provide some inspiration, but it's really a jumping off point for the actual hard research of like, what are the legalities of this that we need to pay attention to. And secure tenure is absolutely vital for a farm and ranch to be sustainable. So for that land tenure to be secure, it includes a number of conditions. So, the land has to be affordable to get that land access for people, and it has to be available. The long-term stability of that access is really important for farming over a long term. So I know a number, and this happens really to me most visibly often with community gardens in urban areas. People will find vacant lots, set up a community garden, often with the agreement of the landowner, but then the landowner finds some more valuable use for that land. Somebody wants to develop housing or apartments or something else on that spot, and all of a sudden that community garden goes away. Even if they had a agreement, usually that does not provide that long-term stability. So thinking about legally how to create those long-term stable options for people is really important for long-term farm sustainability. And whatever is happening has to be compatible with the laws, terms, and deeds in that community where this is happening. And there are other considerations. So if you own land outright and the land becomes more valuable over time, you can appreciate equity in that. So it can be an investment, but depending on how that works, if you are in a community garden, which is often a community amenity, values in that community are going up. Unless you own that piece of land, the increase of value of that property doesn't go to the gardeners who have added this community amenity. So having that stable, secure tenure option is really important for that. And then other things for the long-term viability of farm operations. You need housing, both for the farmer and also if there are workers that you need to keep your farm going. And you need infrastructure and other facilities to support whatever your goals are on that property. So the ability to put those things on there for a farmer to invest in property, is really important to have that long-term sustainability, because it is, and again, I see this a lot like across the country in urban gardens or urban community farm contexts where, farmers will invest in the long-term health of their soil, so really build up the soil as an investment. They might put hoop houses or other things on that property, but unless they have that like long-term security in a form of either a really long-term lease or some sort of ownership model, a developer will just come in, buy it from the current owner who allows that to happen, allows them to use that and build buildings, and then those investments that the farmers or gardeners have made, that gets ripped out from under them. So if we're really trying to create a sustainable food and farming system, we need to think about how can people create this. And why are we talking about alternative land access? We have these two models. You can buy land or lease land already. So why are we talking about this? Well, we need a lot of new farmers over the coming next 20 years, next 10 years. The average age of the American farmer is going up and up. The size of American farms on average is getting bigger and bigger, and it really makes it hard for new and beginning farmers to come in, for people who have historically been left out of the farming system to have access to land to start farms. So that's why we're going to talk about alternatives. Here's just a quick graph I pulled. K-State has their annual report of land values in the state of Kansas. So here is Kansas is this green area under this, and there's like the United States average for land values. So you can see, land was relatively inexpensive in the 50s through the 70s. And then it's really taken off over the past few decades. And so for people who are starting farms, people who are interested in starting farms, this is really one of the primary insurmountable barriers for a lot of people. The other barrier, I would say, is accessibility. So if we're talking about farmland on a broader scale, there's only so much of it. It's like they're not making any more land. That's very true. So if you have, a number of farm operations in a community who are looking to expand, it takes a special landowner who's maybe retiring or inherits some farmland. They can rent it for high rates to any number of operations that are all looking to expand. So if you're a new and beginning farmer in that community, it takes someone to maybe take a chance on you versus going with a big established operation to be able to access that land, to be able to share that with you. And for the farmers, that's often a little bit of simplicity. There's an established operation, they can come in, farm that land, it's pretty simple, all of that's built in, but it can also be an economic decision. A new and beginning farmer most of the time can't pay as much as a successful established farmer in that community. So for a farmer whose retirement might depend on the value of that land, supporting them through their retirement, figuring out how to make this work, even if they wanted to lease it to a new and beginning farmer, can be a challenge. And then there is this other idea to look for alternatives. There are people who are just interested in changing the structure of society, the way things work. Maybe they have inclination towards more cooperative or communal aspects, things that are a little bit outside of the norm of American culture. So this is one other reason that people sometimes look at alternative ideas for how do we create this land access for people, aside from just leasing it or selling it at the highest price to the highest bidder who makes the easiest transaction. So that's kind of the background of where we're starting with. And then we'll dive in a minute to some of those other things. So as both someone looking to access land and someone with land who is trying to think about what to do with that, there's a lot of different factors that play into that. So what is that person's individual or business goals? what is their current financial position. So if you have a lot of money and a lot of land, maybe you could sell it at a lower price or lease it at a lower price to a beginning farmer. You could take that risk. Versus if you are trying to make sure you have enough money for your retirement, you're probably trying to get as much out of that asset as you can. As a farmer, looking to lease land, what are your individual goals, and how does that impact what you're looking for? And I'll give some examples of kind of all of this in the real world and a little bit here. Other aspects that might impact your decisions. What are your capital needs? If you're a new and beginning farmer, you have a limited amount of capital. If you need to buy some land as well as install some infrastructure, put a well, build a barn, put a high tunnel, whatever all those things are, that can really impact your ability to access some land, purchase land, lease land. And then again, at the end of the day, the earning potential of your business is really a critical factor in terms of how much of a return you need to make on that land, what kind of options you have, and how well you can prove that. Can you go get a bank loan? If you have a solid business plan that can prove you're really going to cash flow pretty well on a piece of property, you might be able to access something that is a little bit out of the reach for other people that are maybe in a similar situation as you, but maybe have a different business plan or idea. So that's kind of all the setup as the background to why we're talking about alternative land access, and hopefully enough conceptual pieces that you can follow these different models. They're all based on those same principles of buying and leasing land, but they come about it in a variety of different ways to make that land more accessible, more affordable for new and beginning farmers, or even established farmers who are looking to expand but maybe very limited by capital. Okay, so here's what we're going to dive into. We're going to talk about cooperative ownership. We're going to talk about incubator farms. And then we're going to talk about land trusts in two different fashions. So we're going to talk first about land trusts and conservation easements. And then we're going to talk about community land trusts and this idea that some people call farmland commons. I've seen it called agrarian commons. There's other sort of names. It seems like different organizations want to call more or less the same concept by whatever their own name is, but it's more or less the same idea. So we're going to go through each of these concepts, talk about sort of what is the basis of it, and then talk about examples of farmers that are using that model across the country. I've got a couple of Kansas examples here, and then we'll have some time for questions. A lot of these things, maybe incubator farms a little bit less, but a lot of them can be, again, legally somewhat complicated. So that's where, people have figured out how to make all of these work, but I'm not going to be able to provide you individual examples of how to make that work in your own situations. All right, so cooperative ownership is an idea that I think is relatively straightforward and intuitive. So this is multiple people or organizations or whatever pooling their capital together to be able to buy something that maybe individually they couldn't afford, or lease something that they couldn't afford. Cooperatives are an interesting concept because there's a number of different ways to go about it. I've seen cooperatives operating on a very informal basis. In general, I would say that's not necessarily the best idea, just because if there are disagreements down the road, if there are issues down the road, if you have a bunch of handshake agreements amongst a number of people, that can get really complicated if somebody wants to leave, or if there's a disagreement, trying to figure out how to disentangle all of those things. And so then, in the United States, you can have a formal cooperative. So agricultural cooperatives are something that are created by law at the federal level as a form of business. It's a little bit strange to think about why it's a unique form of business, but in general in the United States, price fixing is illegal. So in spite of everything you heard from our keynote speaker this morning, where it's like there's a ton of price fixing and collusion happening amongst these big corporations, in general, folks working together to fixed prices is something that is against the law, with the exception of legal cooperatives in agriculture. So the government in the 30s viewed that there is a value to farmers working together to create that. So there were avenues made, actually I think 1920 is the enabling legislation that allow farmers to work together to do something that I guess theoretically is essentially illegal. So you can have a formal agricultural cooperative. There's a lot of them that often end up on the marketing side where it is that sort of price fixing thing again. But you could also have that in land ownership model. But you don't have to have that. You could have an LLC, which limited liability company, that could operate. LLCs are organized at the state level. You file with the Secretary of State creating this LLC, but then there's an operating agreement among the members of the LLC that defines how that operation is going to function. And so you could write an operating agreement for an LLC that functions more or less as a cooperative. One of the key principles of a cooperative versus just a partnership is that the cooperative, it's one member, one vote. So it's not if you buy 80%, you get 80% of the control, and the person that invests 20% gets 20% of the control. So that keeping people, so it's one member, one vote is sort of the foundational theoretical basis of a cooperative, and so you could write that into your operating agreement as an LLC. I did bring along a book. This is published by Sarah, The Farmer's Guide to Business Structures. It's a wonderful book. You can get this digitally for free at the SARE website, sare.org, which is Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education. It's a federal program that is administered through regions. But they have this wonderful publication, and this was written by lawyers, so it goes way more in depth about different structures, corporate structures, LLCs, sole proprietorships. But in the back here, they have a chapter that talks about creating that kind of cooperative ownership structure, legal considerations to think about as you're doing that, things to watch out for, the pros and the cons of that concept. So if you're interested in that, I would highly recommend checking out that book. Here's kind of, just some notes. It started out as a list of pros and cons and just kind of came to a few points to make. Some of the good things about this cooperative ownership. Did you have a question?
Yes. So when you say one member, one vote, that means that if one member says no, then it's just a no?
Well, so you can define how that would work in that legal agreement. So you could operate where you do have to have a consensus model and everyone has to agree on something. Or you could do like a simple majority. Often those kinds of agreements will be structured in a way that there's like the major decisions, and those might need a consensus. Like, are we going to go take out $1 million loan with this group? I mean, that ties everybody in that group to that big loan. So like maybe everybody has to agree on that, but a smaller decision, maybe a simple majority would carry that. And that's all sort of in the details of that operating agreement, how you structure that. No, the filing occurs at the state level, but the legislation that defines that is at the federal level. So if you create a cooperative in Kansas, you would file here with Kansas, and there are some state-specific regulations for that, but what allows that in the realm of agriculture was created by that federal legislation. So Kansas, I'm not going to remember like what the regs are in Missouri, but Kansas has certain, like if you're an agricultural cooperative, you need to have 5 members to establish, versus an LLC, you could create this cooperative LLC with 3 members, but like in Kansas law, to create an agricultural cooperative, the minimum is 5 members. And then there are other kinds of cooperatives, like you could create a child care cooperative in Kansas, but that one I think it's like the minimum is like 20 members. So there are different rules for different things. But yeah, the sort of enabling legislation for that is a federal thing. So yeah, some of kind of the benefits of this is like, yeah, if you have more people, you can pool that money and maybe get access to something you couldn't as individuals. Often, having a bigger plot of land, there's a lot of stewardship that needs to occur to manage that. So if it's more than any one person wants to take, having that cooperative, like you can share that work together. One of the challenges, it's like, you still need money. I mean, if we're talking about just making a cooperative to buy land, the members of that have to have enough money together to buy that. So if you have a bunch of people who are limited with the capital assets they have, it doesn't all of a sudden solve that problem, but it's a tool that could work for that. The other thing I would say is like American culture, like this is, a lot of what happens in American culture is sort of based on a competitive mindset, and cooperative efforts require trust among members. It requires, some skills in negotiation, other things that are like, maybe not muscles that all of us exercise every day. It requires, maybe a different mindset. It works great for some people, but it can take time to build up trust among potential members. So sometimes it can be a little bit slow to create that. I put here it can be legally intensive. Like I said, if you're creating that if you want to go start a business as a sole proprietor, it's easy. You just go start selling stuff and you have a business. But if you want to create a cooperative model, yeah, you need to spend time to think through these things. Like, what are the decisions that we need a majority on? What are the decisions that we need consensus on? And you have to work through all of that. And that can be complicated. And I would say, it is something that really, if you're interested in this, it really is worth trying to find the funds to get a lawyer to help you work through that, so you make sure that all of those, your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed. So in 5 years, when there's some disagreement among members, like, you're not struggling to figure out how to solve that. You've thought about what are the possibilities in that creation document that allow you to resolve those conflicts. Yeah.
So can a co-op be, can it be passed down, like the next generation? Like if someone from the co-op dies, then
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, that's something that you would deal with in either that operating agreement or the cooperative organizing articles of organization for that cooperative. What happens if someone dies? What happens if someone wants to leave, like they're done being part of this cooperative? How do their shares get bought out? Or what happens if people want to join? Those are all things that, like, sitting down and thinking through that is really, I think, part of the value. And in legally intensive, those are the things you want to put down in writing, like how do we deal with those issues before they come up, so that when they do come up, So sometimes maybe you could pass along that membership in the co-op, to your kids. Maybe sometimes if someone dies, like that sort of terminates their part of the agreement. There would be some value that could get passed on, but maybe the membership doesn't get passed on. So those are all things to think about as you're organizing that. One of the things, so I was a co-founder of a cooperative here in Kansas, and one of the things that, thinking about like new members coming in, I said LLCs can function as a co-op. You could write those operating agreements in a way that functions cooperatively. But when we were organizing, there is in Kansas a barrier at like 35 members. If you have above that a cooperative, it's still relatively easy to add new members. If you have an LLC and you want to add like the 36th member in Kansas, then you have to go through a bunch of Securities and Exchange Commission federal hoops to make you more or less become like a big corporation where you have to do all your 10K filings and all of that. So if you're a small group, that LLC can be an easier way possibly to do that. If you want to become a cooperative, it can be easier if you want to grow bigger. Now, one of the challenges with this, I said, this is a little bit outside of the sort of way most American business occurs. There are lots of big cooperatives out there, but in general, there's a lot more corporations and LLCs. So if you're having, like, working through all this legal stuff, if you're trying to form a formal cooperative, it can be hard to find a lawyer who knows how to do that. There's a lot of lawyers that can help set you up with an LLC. Pretty much anybody that does business law will have done that lots and lots and lots of times for businesses. But to find someone that does that for cooperatives, especially for small cooperatives, they might have a hard time with that. So a lot of the cooperative lawyers, like their experiences with like large grain marketing cooperatives, or like Land O'Lakes, which is a huge, I don't know, multi-billion-dollar company, like that's a cooperative. Organic Valley is a cooperative, but those are all like hundreds of members or thousands of members. So it's a different model. So it's hard to find people. Dakota? Yeah. Yeah. So K-State does have the Arthur Capper Cooperative Development Center, and I would say that their resources and their expertise is more on that larger scale, like grain cooperatives. So in terms of organizing smaller, a group of 6 farmers who want to buy a piece of land, like, I don't want to say they're not helpful, but that's like a little bit outside of their realm of expertise. There are organizations around, like the Rocky Mountain Cooperative Development Institute. There's a number of them. Cooperative Development Services that's up in Minnesota that can be useful, but there are different states have different cooperative laws, some of which are more permissive than Kansas in certain ways. So there can be some challenges with that too. So I would say in Kansas, it's hard to find the right people to help you with that. Not impossible, but it's not like every business lawyer can't help you form a cooperative, or they maybe could, but it's outside of their realm of expertise. And the other thing I'll say is there are anti-corporate farming laws in the state of Kansas and a number of other states in the Midwest. So you have to be aware of that. And this book has actually, again, just back here in the back, I don't know if it's quite in the index, but they have these flow charts. Like if you want to create a business in Kansas, what do you need to not violate this anti-corporate farming laws? So there are laws that corporations outside of family farm corporations, there's certain things that allow it. So you can make a family farm corporation, but you can't have giant corporations come in and buy farmland to grow crops on. So as you're organizing your cooperatives, you have to make sure that you're not violating any of those laws. So it's not a hoop that's hard to jump through, but it's something, again, you have to be aware of and why you would want a good lawyer if you're doing this. I'll just give an example, and this one's real easy for me because that's my farm there. That's not this year. I didn't grow any crops this year, but a few years ago. And Common Harvest Farms is an LLC that I established with my neighbor because we both wanted. She already had land. She wanted to expand. I was renting land, and I wanted a farm, but we didn't have enough money to do it on our own, either of us. And also, a specific parcel, that parcel of land was more land than either of us wanted to manage. So we joined forces, created an LLC that has sort of cooperative principles in the guiding documents. And we pooled our money essentially and bought a farm that we share management of, we share ownership of. It creates a kind of a weird situation, like where I live, I rent my house from my business, but it works out in a way. And so that's an easy example for me to talk about and answer questions, but it was that there was an opportunity to buy a piece of land that both was more expensive and more land than either of us wanted to manage, but together it became the right thing and we could figure out how to make it work. In our operation, we have some areas that we each operate separately. So we have this LLC that's sort of organized cooperatively, and then we have subsidiary businesses one of which my business partner manages, one of which I manage, and we have our own space to grow fruits and vegetables, and then we have a number of things we do together. So we haven't grown wheat in a few years, but we used to grow and mill turkey red wheat. Here we had a very old Alice Chalmers all-crop combine that we would use for that. We grew wheat on a small scale, but we milled it into flour, so it was pretty profitable for us. But that was like a joint venture. So like under our sort of cooperative umbrella, we had each of us doing separate things and then doing things together. And that's all just like something you can set up as you wish, yeah.
So when you come together like that and buy the land, is it like we both own all of this land together, or in the contract is it like you get this half of the tract and these square knowledge and you get that?
So in our operating agreement is where we specify that piece. Legally, the company owns all of the land, and our business partner owns 50% of the company, and my wife and I own 50% of the company. So it's like legally, like that business owns everything, which is why I say I rent my house from myself, more or less, well, and our business partner. But yeah, so, but then how we operate that is what you specify in the operating agreement, like who gets to do what with what part, who can do what without approval, like, you know, can you sublease your land to somebody else without consulting and everybody agreeing on that? Like, that's possible, but that's not how we've agreed to it. So anyway, so a lot of that is like worked out individually, like you can figure out how to do that in a way that works for you. Any other questions before we move on? I saw, yeah, Connie.
Just for a technical part, so 3 is the number for the smallest co-op?
In Kansas, for something that's called a cooperative, it has to be 5 to legally organize as a cooperative.
Where is the 5?
No, so this is an LLC that operates, so we are not legally a cooperative.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So if you do it through an LLC, the numbers don't necessarily matter.
Until in Kansas, if you hit 35, then the number matters. So an LLC is easier to operate a small cooperative model in Kansas, but if you want a bigger one, then it becomes a challenge to add more members. So that 36th member, if you are an LLC, you have to start doing SEC filings, which are extraordinarily complicated and very legally intensive. If you're a legally organized cooperative, you have to have at least 5 members, but then you can add, I don't know if infinite, but add additional members easily, so without the SEC filings. Yeah. So that's all I'm going to talk about with that sort of just cooperative ownership. There are things that tie into these other pieces as well. So incubator farms, this is where a third party holds ownership of the land and creates a space to help especially new and beginning farmers incubate their farms. These are designed to be low barrier to entry to help new and beginning farmers establish businesses. These aren't something that occur just across everywhere in the country, so they're kind of dependent on if there's one near you or if you can work to organize one near you. One of the challenges that a number of these have is they'll lack long-term stability. Ideally, you know, given the name, they're incubating these new businesses and they're hoping that they hatch to go set up their own farms somewhere else. So sometimes there will be timelines for you can be here for 5 years and then we're kicking you out. So that we talked about long-term stability, that isn't always the case in all of them. Often there's like tool sharing that occurs that can be complicated. Other aspects of management, sometimes they're established by a nonprofit organization or a county government in Douglas County. And so, you know, the farmers might not have as much control over what happens. Those decisions can be made, you know, by the nonprofit or by the county. Here I will just use the example of Common Ground in Lawrence, which is an incubator farm. The city owns 5 acres of land that they've dedicated to this, which is managed by Douglas County. And over time, it's changed how it works. It started out that there was kind of like a set guideline for how long farmers could be there. And there were a lot of farms that either started or started and folks decided they didn't want to farm, and then some folks that sort of went through that incubation and grew a successful farm business and went and bought a piece of land somewhere else. That has changed now so that there is possibility for longer term tenure. So here are some pictures out there. I'm not sure, Connie probably knows how many farmers are there this year, or do you not?
I think it's 5.
5, so yeah, in that 5 acres, people have different access to plots, they can grow what they want, and yeah, part of that change to the longer term, not like we're not kicking you out after 5 or 9 years, was understanding that like investing in the soil, investing in perennial crops are long-term investments, and it doesn't make as much sense to just push people through. So that is another model that's pretty common across the country, that there will be incubator farms. Oh yeah, there's Dakota. We got some people here. So I'm not going to talk about that too long, but I'm happy to answer questions about that. But I'm going to dive into these last 2 things with land trusts, because they're, I would say, a little bit more complicated. And within land trusts, there's 2 different paths. And I would just say there's conservation land trusts and community land trusts. And if you are interested in the conservation land trusts, Kansas Land Trust Director Caitlin Stanley is going to be giving a presentation in the next breakout session in that room to talk about land trusts and conservation easements in a lot more depth. So if you're curious about that, you can go check that out. But I'll dive into both of these paths. So conservation easements, this is going back to that intro where we were talking about land ownership or leasing is a bundle of rights. One of those rights is to develop that land. And so there was the concept that was developed of a conservation easement where you can sell that right or donate that right, and that land is no longer accessible for development. There's also what's called an agriculture easement, where you could say this piece of land has to be in agriculture in perpetuity. So those rights are either sold or donated to a land trust, and that organization then holds those rights for those pieces of land in perpetuity, usually, which means like forever. Now the thing about this is, you're like, what does that have to do with land access? The value of land is driven by what people can do on it. So if you sell off some of those rights or donate those rights, the value of that land goes down. And this is really the most notable, like right around urban areas, where that land might be facing pressure from those developers to put up a apartment building or build a mall or whatever is a more economically lucrative for the developers. But if those rights are gone and that land is not available for that development, the value of that land is lower. It preserves farmland for future generations, so someone that's spent their life farming might be interested in preserving that land for the future as farmland, but it will limit the sort of return that they can get, and it can limit how much money they can make from that land, but it can make that land cheaper and more accessible to new and beginning farmers, or even established farmers who are looking to buy land. So that land trust is the organization that's holding those rights. They can have funding to buy those. Sometimes farmers donate them. How do they get money that an individual farmer can't? They're a nonprofit organization, so people can donate money to them that the people then get a tax write-off for. There are also federal programs, one called ACEP, Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, where you can get federal dollars to the land trust to buy these easements. So there are ways that they can do that to get access to those easements. And then those ownership rights are lost, which can be a challenge because you have to know what you want to do with that land forever or in perpetuity. So if you have a farm and you say all of this has to be in crop production or pasture forever, and you want to build a barn there, that can be limited. You can write those into those easements, like this area is available to add buildings, or this area is available to do X, Y, or Z, and that area has to be in row crops or agriculture. But it can create some challenges. So you need really like foresight when you're doing that. But there's this idea called buy, protect, sell. And I'll give an example of that. So this one's come up a lot. It's one that's happening right now in Minnesota, where there is a farmer who owns Singing Hills Dairy. She doesn't have any heirs, so when she passes on, there's no one to inherit the farm, but she wants to keep it in farming. And then there's a family farm, a group of farmers, the Lohr family, who have been farming for many years in the Twin Cities area, but they don't have enough money to buy a farm. So what's happening is American Farmland Trust has bought Singing Hills Dairy. They took the conservation easement out on that property. They fundraised to do that, so they bought the farm and then they sold it to the Lohr family for less money than they bought it for, because the value of that farm went down because those conservation easements had been put on all the land. So the land's no longer available for development, but it's available for agriculture. So American Farmland Trust bought the land, protected it as permanent farmland with those easements, and then resold it at a lower price. So that's a model that has happened a number of places across the country. American Farmland Trust is active in that. Other land trusts around the nation have been active in that kind of model, but it can make a farm that's unaffordable for a farm family looking to continue or looking to buy land for the first time, and it can lower that purchase price for them. And then we'll talk about the other model of land trusts, the community land trusts. These are distinct in that this land trust doesn't just own those conservation easement rights, they own the land and they use that for their benefit. And these were developed actually for housing. So there's a number of community land trusts around where they will own a lot of houses. And then what they'll do is they provide really long-term leases. Or a number of community land trusts will own the land, but the people can buy the building on it. So the land trust always has control because they own the land under the building, but the people can buy the house. Well, that same model can work in farmland. So there's a number of organizations. Farmland Commons calls this the Farmers Land Trust. Agrarian Trust calls it the Agrarian Commons. So there's a number of community land trusts that will buy land or help us create nonprofits within communities to buy and hold land. And then those will make leases that are extremely long-term, like a 99-year lease is a very common one. So the farmer doesn't own the land, but they essentially have control of that land for their lifetime. And often those leases are inheritable. So if they're creating that farm, they don't have to buy the land, but they have to comply with this lease terms. And that often makes the land that is unaffordable very affordable for folks. So those organizations, Agrarian Trust and Farmland Trust, they have models of this online, like sample documentation of like how do you write this up. But yeah, these organizations will own and manage the land, and then they will offer affordable leases, because their goal, if they're a farmland land trust, is to help farmers access land. So they're buying the land and leasing it at affordable rates. They can provide farmers with equity opportunities. So again, like the farmers often own the buildings on top of that land. They can appreciate, like the value of their business can appreciate, but they don't get benefits if the value of the land goes up, because that is owned by the organization. Often these are created with that model of real change, a sort of social change is the basis for this. So they might have stipulations on what you can do. You have to do regenerative agriculture. They might have other things in there about how those have to be managed. An example of this is West Haven Farm, which is just outside of Ithaca, New York. West Haven Farm, there's an eco-village there, so a development that was made by developers focused on creating an ecological community, so small, sustainable housing. But as part of that community, they had an area that they dedicated to farming. So there's 10 acres that community owned originally when it was being developed, that they said, we want this to be in farming forever. So they created one of these community land trusts with the Finger Lakes Land Trust up there that owns the land that West Haven Farm sits on. And they have a 99-year lease that they've sold to West Haven Farm. And they are, the owners of West Haven here are actually the second generation on that farm. So when that eco-village was built in the 70s, there was a farmer, that farmer retired, and they sold it to the next generation here of West Haven Farm. And that has like stipulations on it that it has to be farmed organically. But there's a couple here who actually came to the United States as farm workers. So they were in the area doing grape harvest. You know, the Finger Lakes region is known for their wine, and so they were moving through the area, harvesting grapes, had farming background, really wanted to start a farm, but couldn't afford farmland. And so through this, they were able to lease that land under their farm and build a really thriving business up there just outside of Ithaca. So that's really, they don't own the land, they lease it, but they lease it with a long enough window that they can control it. They can invest in the soil health. They can invest in buildings. They've built a lot of buildings on the land, high tunnels, packing sheds, things like that. So they have that long-term secure land tenure, but they're able to access that land at affordable leasing rates. So when you pull all those together, you know, I've provided some different options. How do you think about that? If you want to access land, like what should you do? You know, like you got to think about what you can afford, what other assets and resources are available. Like, do you know other people that maybe you want to go into a cooperative ownership structure with? You know, is there a land trust in your area that maybe you can work with to create one of these? Is there an incubator farm in your area? How much security do you need for the long term? Because all of these things have different necessarily long-term things. And then what is your vision for your farm? Because like, you know, if you want to pass down a legacy to the next generation, like your kids specifically, some of these models work easier for that than others. You know, like an incubator farm probably isn't what you want to be looking for. You want to look for something that has longer term tenure or possibilities. And then really a lot of these rely on community. So getting to know people in your area, working with them or working with those other resources that might be available in your community are really important. Yeah.
So so with the conservation easement, you don't own your land anymore once you put it in the easement?
So with a conservation easement, you own your land, but usually what happens with those is you've taken off some of the rights. So the right to develop, the right to build apartment building on your land, like that right no longer exists. Even though you own the land, you can't do that. In the same way as like a utility easement means you own the land, but they can come in and put a power line across it. You don't have the right to develop that land, but you have all the other rights maybe. So that's, you're selling off some of that bundle of rights or donating some of that bundle of rights, which then lowers the value of that land and makes it more accessible. Yeah.
So, if it's set for a certain kind of farming perpetually, what if you get sick?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly challenges with that. The burden in that situation with conservation easements, that burden kind of falls to the land trust to make sure that that land is managed in that way. And so you'd probably have to work with them to figure out how to continue to do that. And I don't, you know, that's probably a specific situational, like what that resolution is. But that would be something like you have to work with. I mean, essentially, you co-own that piece of land. Like you own these rights, they own those rights. And that's really common. So like a lot of people will have sold off their mineral rights. Like you own your farmland, but if somebody sells their mineral rights and they find oil under there, they can come on and take the oil out. Like that's very common. So it's kind of that same situation. Like you have to work with the other owners to figure out how to work that out. Yeah. The other one is just selling a conservation easement. So those are called conservation land trusts usually. And community land trusts, yeah. So the conservation land trusts usually just own that conservation easement. The community land trust usually owns the whole land, and you rent the land with long-term lease from them. And so really, we provided these examples. If you're thinking about something like this, like what's right for you, that goes back to like your values, your vision, and your goals. Like you really have to think about defining what you want to do with your farm in a very intensive way. If you buy the land, you can do whatever, and you can change your mind in 5 years and do something different. And oh, I want to stop farming and build a bunch of houses. You can do that if you own your land just outright. But if you do some of these other things, you really have to think about like, what is my long-term vision? What are my long-term values? What are my goals? And just to think about those, values are kind of that top level, like what is really important to you, community, resilience, yeah.
Is it possible to do a co-op and then also have a land trust as like put the co-op under the land trust?
I think you certainly could do that. Yeah. I'd have to think about why you do that, because often those land trusts, they're a nonprofit organization, so you could have like a community land trust that you define what membership is in that organization and who gets a vote on things. So you could almost set that up with those cooperative principles. It wouldn't be a cooperative, but it could almost mimic that cooperative ownership. Yeah, that sort of like, how do you have power? Like you could do it, structure it a little bit that way. So yeah, thinking about what your values are, those sort of high-level guiding principles, family, equality, fairness, thinking about your vision. What do you really want to do? Like boiling it down into a real succinct thing is, if your vision is that you're passing something down to your children, that might be different than if your vision is just like you want to keep this piece of land in farming forever, or you want to build a new food system for your community. Like the things you do depend on what that vision looks like. And then, yeah, the goals are like the steps that you take to get there. And so thinking about all of those things and then coming up with goals will really help you figure out if any of these are right for you or which one of these alternatives might be right for you, to help you think about ways to access other things. There are a bunch of resources out there. There's this great website called Farmland Access that talks about all of these things and a few other concepts, but really dives in deeper, has additional case studies. The organization, Rachel, who wrote this book, she works for an organization called Farm Commons. They have a guide for cooperative purchasing and financing of farm and ranch land. I mentioned this book. They have a chapter in the back called Forming a Co-op. The Rural Center, we have resources on our website for beginning farmers and ranchers. K-State has some resources for their Office of Farm and Ranch Transition. And there's an organization called Farm Tender, which is a farmland matching organization. It's an app basically where, especially for regenerative farmers, people that want to rent or sell their land to regenerative farmers, and then people looking for land can meet on the app. So at that, I'm open for any questions or discussion. Yeah.
So with a co-op, could that keep a family from going into heirs property?
Yeah, so that would